Okay, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session on history and politics. We have here our first speaker, Diem, and the title of the talk is A Social Scientist International, Rudolf, Broda, and the Question of Global Progress from 1907 to 1932.
Exactly. Sorry. Yeah, can you hear me? No, right? No, it's not on. Yes? Okay. Yes. Okay. Very nice. So thank you very much to the organizers for putting this together and for giving me an opportunity to present my research here. I want to talk about the intersection of socialism, sociology, and the debate about global progress in the early 20th century through the lens of Rudolf Broda's project, which is unfortunately not very well known, but you will learn more about it now. I will first talk about Broda's larger project, like his ideas and how he set it up. Then I will introduce him, since he's not so well known. Then I will talk a bit about this socialism-sociology link as it is relevant in his project, and about the milieu of four institutions that I think is really relevant to the project, and ultimately there are some conclusions. So his project consisted of four components. The first is a series of journals, which I will elaborate more about in a second. The journals, and so in a sense the project, were published between 1907 and 1932. Of course, they shifted. Many of them were very short-lived, but then they popped up again, and there were journals all over Europe. I will talk more about this in a second. The second branch of the institute was called the Institut International pour la Diffusion des Expériences Sociales, which was founded in Paris in 1909, and which aimed at organizing public lectures by experts. And hence, it was a kind of a public education project, or the public education branch of his project. The third part is the Ligue Internationale pour l'Organisation du Progrès, which meant to publish scientific studies, mostly historically comparative studies, and do political advocacy work in the interest of global progress. And ultimately, the seat of the institute in Paris, which was active from 1907 to 1914, served as a library and an expert hub, where whoever had any question on, for example, the women's movement in Finland, or new religious movements in India, could ask, and then they would be paired with an expert on the field, and they could kind of match and have their questions answered. So all of this was basically just a big project to study and ultimately to organize global progress. And of course, since it was active over the course of 25 years, it changed shape, and it also changed the topics several times. So now, more about the journals. The first journals were called Documents of Progress and appeared in Paris, in Berlin, and in London in 1907. They were really extensive. They appeared monthly, and each issue had more than 100 pages. They became a really big success really quickly, and the project expanded with 3 more journals. There was the first expansion was the Russian expansion in St. Petersburg, Zaporozhye. Then came the Hungarian version. Unfortunately, I don't read Hungarian, but here it is for the Hungarian speakers among you. And ultimately, in 1912, there was also an Esperanto journal from Madrid called Omago. So the project really was an instant success, much more than Broda had ever hoped. And apart from these journals, which were the official journals of the project, there were affiliated journals. For example, there was one in Calcutta, which was called the Modern Review. And there were also journals in Latin America, which were loosely affiliated with the project. And just as an interesting fact, the patron figure and the co-editor of the Russian journal was Maxim Kovalevsky, who's a towering figure of Russian sociology. I think he's kind of considered the founder of Russian sociology, and he was a correspondent of Marx and Engels, and some of his works were actually used by Engels in his book, like The Family, Private Property and the State, that he published in 1884. So he's really part of that kind of original crowd of legal and economic sociologists, so to say. So then the programmatic statements in the first issue of these journals, you can read some excerpts of here. What we see is that there's an encyclopedic moment in the sense that they try to collect all kinds of progressive developments all over the world and bring them together, but not just to collect them, but to actually also analyze them sociologically. So already here we see that in the second statement you can see that sociological analysis was going to be like the science and the method with which to kind of read this information, to digest it, and to deduce from that how to organize progress and how to apply experiences from one culture or nation to another culture or nation. So we can also see that this whole project is, of course, like founded on universalism. The idea is that any experience of any people is relevant to another people and it's kind of interchangeable. But it also accounts for differences, of course, and differences in like the historical process of how institutions have grown and how cultures have developed. Yeah. Exactly. So then, if you wonder, so what exactly did they actually talk about under the name of progress? Here you go. This is some of what they talked about. So they talked about a lot of different topics. This is just this is not an exhaustive, obviously, list of the themes, but this just is to show you some of the, with like a proportional, like the size of the font is more or less proportional to the importance or the frequency of the topic that was discussed. So it was a really diverse, a really broad debate. And so that also was true for the people who participated in it. So it was a really diverse, large group of people from all over the world. You will see that later. And in many different reform movements of the time which were involved in the project, and it was really a network of networks, in a sense. And funny enough, actually, I have already learned a lot at this conference. I was a bit blind to all these issues of educational reform and child's welfare. And yesterday I went through the journals again and I realized, wow, actually the topics are all over as well. So everybody has their biases, and I had mine and I didn't see that, but it's also part of the story. Here again, a map which is again not exhaustive, but just to show you a little bit where these correspondents were sitting in the world who were documenting progressive movements in their parts of the world and contributing to the debate. So the red dots are where the journals appeared or were published, and the green dots, I don't know if you can see it, are some of the places from where people reported and sent in their analysis. Anyway, so already within the first 3 years of the project in 1909, they had already accumulated more than 200 correspondents who wrote on different topics. So it was really quite an impressive undertaking. So now I will talk about Rudolf Broda a little bit, who put all of this together. He's a really interesting figure. Broda was born in 1880 in Vienna into a Jewish family. But both his parents, his father was originally Moses and then became Moritz, so both his parents had converted to Catholicism, but both came from Jewish families. His mother was part of the Bauer family, linked to Otto Bauer, the Austro-Marxist. I think she was his cousin, in fact. So he already as a child, he read utopian socialist literature. He was really impressed, he said later, by Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, this utopian socialist novel, which also then was the origin for a lot of different utopian settlements in the US. Even in his youth, he wrote like plays about mutual understanding and world peace, and he was really fascinated by these themes. As a student, he joined the Social Democratic Party in Vienna, and he was well connected in these social democratic circles. He studied law and political science in Vienna, and then later in Paris at the Collège Libre des Sciences Sociales, where he also got his PhD in political science, and then went on to New York to Columbia University to study sociology with Franklin Giddings and others. In 1905, he made huge inheritance because his father passed away, who had been the owner of a sugar factory. And then with this money, he finally saw himself capable of like putting his ideas into action, and he founded this project, and then 2 years later started the journals that I talked about. In the meantime, between his inheritance and the starting of the journals, he actually went on really extensive travels throughout the world to kind of have a better impression of like what the state of the world was, right? And how, just to kind of have his personal impression. He settled in Paris, where he started the project, and in 1909 he became professor of sociology at the Collège Libre des Sciences Sociales, where he had also got his PhD. Then, as an Austrian in Paris with the outbreak of the First World War, he went into exile to Switzerland, where he stayed. Then in 1916 he was accused of high treason in Austria because of his pacifist writings, and he lost Austrian citizenship and became a naturalized Swiss. And he remained in Switzerland and then initially worked for the League of Nations and the ILO, but very quickly was very disappointed with them and then gave up all his hope on the old continent and settled in the US in the mid-20s, where in 1927 he again became professor of sociology in the Yellow Springs in, what is it called? Now I forgot the name of the college. Never mind. Yeah, Antioch College it was called, exactly. He died in 1932, and that's also in a sense the end date of the project. Because he really was the spiritus rector. He was really the one who kind of kept all of the threads together throughout the time. So now, about this milieu that I think was really crucial for his project to flourish, and from where he recruited many of the people who contributed to his journals. I think there are 4 institutions which are central. So the first is the Institut International de Sociology, which was one of the earliest official attempts to institutionalize sociology as an academic discipline, which was founded in Paris in 1893. I will talk a little bit more about that later. Then there's the Université Nouvelle de Bruxelles, which Marco and Marie already talked about on the first day, and this really builds on that, like the very socialist, politically pretty radical spirit of the Université Nouvelle was crucial. Also, the many exiled Russians who studied at the Université Nouvelle, that's kind of representative for many of there's a large participation of exiled Russians in Broda's project. Most of them are Jewish, but not all of them, of course. Essential. And also, for example, Angelika Balabanov is a central figure in the Italian communist movement. She studied in Brussels, and so did Lenin's sister, Maria, and many of the kind of revolutionaries of the day studied at that university, which was, of course, not formally recognized, but yet had this kind of interesting spirit. The third institute is the Collège Libre des Sciences Sociales, which was a part of this enseignement libre, like free education scene in France, where social sciences were taught. And this is where Broda had studied himself, and his supervisor had studied, and where he then later also taught. And ultimately, there's this very interesting Russian exile university for the social sciences, which existed for 5 years in Paris, which really brought together like the whole intelligentsia of exiled Russians, and not only exiled Russians, but it was really an interesting place. And the point is that all of these 4 institutions shared a large part of their personnel, and the boards were similar on all of these institutions, like they were constituted of the same people. There's also an interesting institutional link, actually, since so many of you are interested in psychology, of the École Russe and the Bechterev Institute for Psychopathology, which was founded in St. Petersburg in 1907. Very many of the people who taught at the École Russe then went back after 1905, after the Constitutional Revolution in Russia, and then were made part of this institute in St. Petersburg. So all of these institutions taught sociology officially. They taught anthropology, history, law. There's a lot of law teaching, actually, lots of international law, political economy, criminology, psychopathology, They had lots of lectures on the labor movement and on cooperatives. 1 minute. Okay. Oh. It tells me 14. Okay.
You can see it.
Oh, yes. All right. 1 minute. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Because here it tells me that it's been on for 14 minutes. Okay. All right. Anyway, so then I'll speed it up, and so yeah, there was one thing that I wanted to say about the Institut International de Sociologie, which I mentioned, which made part of this kind of milieu in Paris. They had their 8th annual congress in Rome, which the story comes full circle to us, which was dedicated to the question of progress. And Broda was not involved in this, but this is just to show how progress was actually really like a leading theme in sociologist circles at the time. It was one of the big problems that they discussed. And the proceedings of the progress, of the conference are like more than 500 pages. So it was a really big, like an interesting document on the debates. Yeah, okay, I wanted to make a very quick point also about how Broda kind of thought of sociology. In the 3rd issue of his journals, he started this big enquête sur la sociologie, in which he said the 19th century has left us with like a great legacy and with one great problem. The legacy is the developments in the natural sciences and the development of evolution with Darwin, the evolution of all creatures inferior to man in a sense. And now the big question that the 20th century is facing is how to study or apply the laws of evolution on human society, and how to match this onto the much more complex kind of structure of human society. And for this, he launched this enquête, where he asked different sociologists about what they thought of the state of sociology and whether sociology was capable of answering the problem in the coming century. And I hope you can read it more or less. These are some of the replies, or the people who replied to this inquiry, and the answers which were printed. So it's the kind of usual suspects, maybe in a sense of the time. Yeah, so I'll wrap up and just say that we see that kind of the early 20th century, the circles around Broda really thought that this was going to be the century of sociology and of the question of global progress, and that sociology was the science which would provide the means to kind of organize a better world for everybody. I also hope that I could very quickly kind of sketch that these institutions in Paris were really kind of essential. I think they provided kind of the milieu and the breeding ground for all these debates. And actually, something which I didn't have time to elaborate on now, but very, very many of the characters who were mentioned over the course of the last few days kind of published in Broda's journal. So many of the Hungarian women that Anna mentioned yesterday were part of it. Auguste Forel, who was on the picture on the first day in the game, he also published with Broda. So, yeah, that's so much from me.
Very good. We have time for questions or comments. Yes. Start with Henry.
Thanks, Anna. Very interesting. The person, the main figure, was inspired by Utopian socialism. And then he established these projects that were based on an idea of progress. But what I know about social democracy is that it doesn't really match well with utopian ideas. It's based on piecemeal reformism. That Utopia wants to change the world right now. It's much more radical, ahistorical. So I'd just like to know what was the basic idea of progress for Rudolf Broda. Was it like social engineering of better society using social science and so forth, or did he have a more fundamental idea of change for a new kind of world, a new kind of human beings that would better suit his enthusiasm for Utopia, Utopia socialism.
Yeah, thank you.
Enlightening us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Exactly. I mean, he would have refuted the label of utopian. He did not. He said he always made very clear that he didn't consider himself or his project utopian. Of course, because they were not dreamers. They were actually doers, and they wanted to create this better world. And they were, social democrats, and they were reformists. Even though I must say that the project, as you see, I mean, there were so many different people, and there were some who were more of the, maybe liberals in a sense, and there were some who were really social revolutionaries. There was a whole section of anarchists who also were part of the project. It really brought together a lot of different.
It was ecumenical.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, I think progress was kind of an organizing principle for a lot of different debates and different kind of ideological, political leanings. But Broda definitely believed in the reformist, democratic parliamentary approach to things. But that doesn't mean that that's the only opinion which was kind of published in his journal. And of course, as I said, the project changed shape and the themes shifted considerably over the course of time, of course, and with the outbreak of the First World War, shattered most of the ideas, and after that the themes looked very different. It was mostly pacifism, advocacy for the League of Nations, a world constitution, disarmament, was these kinds of themes which then took over. Whereas in the Fin de siècle period, it was still this very eclectic. There was occultism and spiritualism, and the Esperanto is an interesting theme which leads throughout the whole, which was actually relevant throughout all the 25 years. But I hope I answered your question more.
He was certainly a cosmopolitan.
Absolutely, yes. Many of them were, in a sense, polymaths and cosmopolitan, and they had experienced several episodes of exile throughout their lives. Many of them,
Okay, we have first Dennis.
It's a simple question. I don't think you covered it. I might miss it if you did. Did both Comte have any influence on him? Obviously, there's some similarities in the vision of sociology. So,
Auguste Comte, you said, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
If I'm pronouncing it right.
Yeah. Yes, he definitely did. I mean, they discussed positivism, and I'm sure that actually, I don't know too much about these positivist networks, but I'm sure that they overlap to a large extent, even though, of course, since they were also, since Broda also accommodated spiritualism and all these other themes, it wasn't it wasn't exclusively positivist, but it had that side of the debate as well. Yeah. Broda himself was certainly, I don't think that Broda was a spiritualist. I think he just kind of accommodated for that in his journals. I mean, he was probably more of a positivist in the Comtean sense,
Anton Bogdanov was a leftist adversary to Lenin. Was the first writer of fantascientific roman, Engineer Min. And in 1922 wrote a book, Technology, the science of organization, for organizing school of the matter of sociology and engineering together. Any relation with Broda?
Yeah, interesting. I'm just thinking. There are so many people involved that I sometimes mess up names, and I think, and I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure, but I'll be very happy to look it up. There are a lot of, several Italians who were involved. There were several Italians who were involved in Broda's project, but Anton Bogdanov, I'm not sure.
Anton Bogdanov was a surname of Malinowski, was an leftist adversary of Diem.
Yeah, I'll be happy to look it up. It doesn't ring a bell at the moment, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't part of it.
Against which Diem wrote materialism and empirical criticism.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'll
with
look into
such
it.
a broad network of collaborators and contributors, it's normal that you can.
No, exactly. And then sometimes I focus on a specific group and then I forget about the others. And but I'll be happy to look at it.
Sure. There was one more question.
Thank you. I have so many questions that I will ask only two. So I have a question regarding the location of the institute. Why did you choose Paris? And did you choose Paris because you studied in Paris and decided to teach in Paris, and then this is how you decided to settle his institute in Paris, or was it another reason behind this? And also the choice of the words that were selected for the name of the institute, the Institut International pour la diffusion des expériences sociales. It's quite interesting when you think of the link he then did with the natural sciences. So I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. About Paris, I'm not sure. I think he had his circle there because he had lived there several years before, and it was obviously a stimulating, interesting environment within which he kind of could situate his project. And he was also well connected in the circles of Jean Jaurès, so I guess he had kind of he was just like well connected to lots of the important people who he thought were useful also in his project. I guess in a sense Paris was just the cultural intellectual capital of Europe at the time in a certain
So he did in German, for example, since he was a German speaker.
I know, yeah. Also Vienna, I know that Vienna had a local chapter, like a local group, and they held a lot of the public talks in Vienna, but they didn't have a publication in Vienna. I mean, the German-speaking publication appeared in Berlin, and I'm also still a bit curious about why he didn't. Yeah, I guess he didn't have a very easy relationship with Austria, which is understandable as a Jew of the time. But I don't know anything about it. The expérience sociale, I also thought that's super interesting, and it again kind of messes up maybe this, or it blurs the lines a little bit between this very clear, I mean, kind of positivist, very rational, kind of analytic approach to things, but also accommodating, the experiential side and occultism and all of these things. Yeah, I have questions about the same thing. Actually, I don't have an answer about it. I think it's Let's talk more about it later.
Okay, that was very good.
Cool.
The questions, maybe as final comment, I can also add a bit on that, because I think you have some things in your research that is overarching. So if you look, for example, at how psychologists were viewing their science and promoting their science at the time, it was also in the name of progress and in the name of offering technical solutions to social problems. So then you can also filter a bit more out what was so specific about this broad area. And the second comment I have is with regard to spiritualism. So the spiritualist movement in the 19th century was the first internationalizing or globalizing movement, because if the idea is that all the spirits are actually connected, because it's like we are spirits, right? We are all ending up in the spirit world. They had the first international conferences already in the 1880s. So I think there could be a link why spiritualism is still there in this to be seen in this journal, just as a hypothesis. But anyway, fantastic topic. I hope we will talk more on that, and thank you.
Thank you.